Thank you so much, Max. And thank you again for hosting such an important forum for everyone to learn and engage with each other. I will be sharing some of the big highlights of this team structure to deepen partnerships between educators and underrepresented families. I wanted to start, though, with finding out who's in the virtual room. So if you could please share in the chat your name, organization you represent, and where you're located, and also what drew you to this webinar. What's maybe one hope you have for our time together? So go ahead and just take the next 15 or 20 seconds to drop that information in the chat. Wonderful, Margaret. Thanks for getting us going. Great, Margaret from Toronto. Lori, good to see you. Lori from Illinois. I think we've got a very global contingent. Debbie, great to see you. Wonderful. Canada, North Carolina, Georgia. See, I think I just saw Colorado, my home state, Michigan. Wonderful. I grew up spending my summers in Michigan. North Carolina, Buffalo, New York. Wonderful. Well, I'm so grateful that you each came today, and it's going to be short and sweet. So I'm going to just share with you some of the real important highlights. And I want to just start with a quick introduction. So I'm Ari Gerzon-Kessler, as Max said, spent the last quarter of a century in public education here in the States. I was a teacher and principal. This is my daughter, my 2.5-year-old daughter, Selah, who's really the thing I'm most passionate about, in addition to family engagement. And I would say, you know, when I look back, particularly on my years in school leadership, there's both some pride around some best practices. For instance, I learned about the impact of positive phone calls the week before I became an assistant principal. And for 9 years, over 5 schools, I made 5 or more calls every Friday to surprise families with good news about their kids. Those 15 minutes were often the most uplifting moments of the week. You know, 5 calls doesn't sound like much, but when you do the math over the course of a school year, that's about 190 phone calls that were going to families. Implementing an award ceremony as a principal at 2 schools where in the morning the staff made a pancake breakfast and we celebrated a child from every class for their academic or character strides, and really brought families in a school community where they'd often been on the margins. Made a huge impact. On the other hand, I look back on my years as a teacher and principal with a lot of regrets, wishing I would have known then all that I've learned since I really became steeped in this field 8 years ago. So I'm excited to share with you the Family and Educator Together model, because it really, to me, has proven to be the most powerful vehicle to accelerate more authentic partnerships. And I'll just spend a couple minutes talking about what I mean by authentic partnerships. So the 2 main things we'll look at is that difference, and then really look at the teams and how they, in 28 of our local schools, continue to drive significant change and really transforming the paradigm for family engagement. You can obviously dive much deeper taking a look at my book that goes into things like how do you effectively facilitate gatherings that are highly diverse and multicultural, as well as all the practical elements of building this framework, as well as a lot of the research around best practice and how to implement it when everyone is so overstretched in education. I want to start with this quote because I think Max and I, before we all came together, were talking about the pandemic, and really this quote speaks to this opportunity we have of creating a new normal. Or if we don't, you know, and we perpetuate the ways of engaging families, there's a chance that we have parents lose whatever faith they have in us. And you all know, I think you're passionate about this field, you know the outcomes, but I always like to just share the fact that so many of the outcomes of family engagement are what our schools care most about. Yet, unfortunately, family engagement has not received the attention I think it deserves in terms of all these amazing outcomes it nets. So you can see pretty much every outcome that matters to a school is created through our efforts around family engagement. And some of the great research about a decade ago out of Chicago, which I share with school leaders every chance I get, is when they did the research around what leads a school or a district to shift from good to great, developing stronger ties with families is one of the top 5 things. Yet I know, looking back as a principal and looking at our schools that don't have teams, that it's very easy to perpetuate the status quo approach to family engagement and um, and have it be on the back burner, where it's very events focused and not receiving the innovative spirit it deserves. So just to take a few minutes to look at authentic partnerships and how they're different than what we typically describe as family involvement. I think some of the biggest differences, and this is of course steeped in the research on the ground in schools, and I see this day in and day out as we try to move more schools towards partnerships, is this shift from one way of we communicated to families, we told them about this event, we did this for them for family engagement, to a more two-way co-creating doing with. A real shift. I mean, when I look back on my years as a principal, and I think this is the case for most of our schools, I believe in the US and Europe today, is when you're looking at events for families, some of the biggest annual events for families, how many parents are sitting around the table helping school staff design a better back to school night, design more meaningful parent teacher conferences. Sadly, it's usually zero. So it's really this shift to co-creating events and moving from this exclusive model of a few parents hold influence to a much more inclusive model, which is what this Families and Educator Together, or what I'll refer to as the FET team model, really creates a sizable shift to making a more inclusive school community. Probably the biggest piece I see is the move from transactional to relational. And that, of course, starts at the front office of a school, moving from how can I help you to greeting a parent by name and developing more personal rapport, which then leads from this shift from surface level trust to really deeper levels. Another part of it, and why the FET teams gather once a month for 90 minutes, is that all too often family engagement are these sporadic opportunities throughout the school year for families to engage versus ongoing regular opportunities. And I think shifting away from this events focus is critical because I did a training for teachers and school leaders in Boston in July. And when I asked them to write, what are all the ways that you currently engage families? It was interesting when I took their papers home, the groups had developed these wonderful lists, and I would say about 90% of it was events that the school did versus some of the tools that we know are best practices, like home visits, weren't on those lists. Using an app to foster more two-way communication across language barriers, things that heighten communication, deepen relationship beyond events, are often missing. And you can see, from the remainder of this list, I think a key piece I want to highlight is this shift of educators doing the talking, educators as experts, to really that we're guiding more through listening and really honoring the expertise that parents bring. So those are I'd say the 10 or so key pieces that shift a school towards a more authentic partnership approach. And I'd say even the schools where we've had teams for 7 or 8 years, no school would say, "Oh, we've nailed it. We have a fully authentic partnership developed with our community." I think it's obviously an ongoing process. And it's really based also in this research from Angela Valenzuela around authentic care, that we're shifting in our engagement with families from an emphasis on ideas and things to a prioritization of nurturing relationships. which includes, I think, a critical piece is a shift from technical language that often puts parents on the outsides when we drop five acronyms in 3 minutes to more expressive language. So, I think about in the States, we'll say something like, yeah, your child's really struggling. We don't know if they need an IEP or a 504, but we're going to bring our SAC team together to discuss that. To, your daughter brings so many strengths to the classroom. We're noticing she's struggling in one particular area. So we really want to come together as a team to help her grow and take these important next steps. Really, that shift, which sounds easy, but we often fall too much into the educational jargon. In the school district I serve, I wanted to create a framework where all of these aspects were really simplified and straightforward. So you can see here the five top elements in collaborating with colleagues at University of Colorado that we defined was the learning and well-being, not just of students, but of parents as well as educators, relationships and trust, sharing more decision-making and power, and then two-way communication. And all of this kind of being undergirded by intercultural understanding and putting more of the onus of that on our educators. And I find that these teams where you'll see it's creating space to listen to families and ask them great questions that lead us to insight on how to create meaningful change, that really fosters deeper cultural proficiency and responsiveness. As educators, professional learning is not from a training, but literally from listening to families. So just curious to take a moment, what did you find most interesting in that quick look at the differences between family involvement and authentic partnerships? I just want to invite a pause from my voice and an opportunity just to reflect in the chat. What was most interesting or impactful for you? Thanks, Diana. Yeah, so prioritizing relationships, trust, and listening. Thank you, Laura. Yeah, it's a culture. It really, like you said, starting with walking through the door, it's bringing in intentionality. It's all too often lacking. Thanks, Addie. Yeah, shifting, prioritizing relational over transactional. Thanks, Ashika. Yeah, relationships and decision making as a partner. And as you'll see as we jump into the team model, these sound good, but the question is, in the midst of the busyness of a school, how do you move the needle and begin to actually make this part of the culture? And so that's how these teams create a steady shift. So we're gonna dive into the Family and Educator Together framework. And as you can see from this quote, this is from a wonderful book on family engagement that came out about a year ago from NAFSky. In a society where institutions are regularly reinforcing quantity over quality, upholding power structures, and superficial and transactional relationships as the norm, what is the remedy? And they say intentionally and systematically making time to build trust, learn from one another, and collaborate. And I would say if I had to capture what these FET, Family and Educator Together teams are in a sentence, it's exactly that. It's intentionally and systematically making the time, creating the space to build trust, learn from one another, and collaborate, and hold the team accountable for creating systemic change in the school. So FET team really has four major aims: elevate these partnership practices. Every school leader can say, yeah, we do family engagement. But can we actually elevate and integrate into the school systems and culture some of the better practices? It's primarily learning from the voice of underrepresented families. As you'll see, 15 minutes is carved out for families to learn about the school, and 30 minutes each meeting is carved out for us as educators to learn from families' perspectives. It's obviously a space to build stronger trust and communication and accelerate meaningful change. FET teams are in their 8th year now. And in the 4th year, what I noticed was we had done a wonderful job of designing and refining a space that built trust across many cultural, linguistic, racial, economic, and other differences. But where we were falling short was we weren't creating enough change so that by April or May, you could see across the school staff that educators were altering their practices. So I began in November, December to really push on our team leaders as we planned the next gatherings to get really intentional around asking questions that would lead to concrete changes. So that's just a piece I want to emphasize because that has been one of the most exciting pieces where one conversation we have leads to a principal saying, yes, I will give a few minutes each month for positive calls, or I actually want to, share a story or two. So um, I was at a middle school in April 2 years ago, and a mom said at a FET gathering, I can't believe I just found out now that my child has a D or an F in one of their classes. Why didn't I know in January, February, or March that they were struggling? And the staff didn't really have an answer. It was, well, we have 125 students each, and that's just, we don't pick up the phone. And what we quickly did in looking at that was, okay, educators need some time to communicate succinctly and efficiently. That principal began giving his staff every 4 to 6 weeks 15 minutes to send texts through a wonderful app called Talking Points that translates the message for teachers into 150 plus languages. And 5 families in those 15 minutes were getting that update. It sparked them to reach back out and ask questions and really start forging a connection with the teacher instead of perpetuating the status quo approach, which is that most parents continue to tell us that they only hear from teachers during conferences and not much in between, especially at the middle and high school level. So that's just one example of how teams propel concrete, meaningful change. And I'll try to share a few more examples in a few moments. I won't read these to you, but two of my favorite books in the field are Natural Allies by Sue Hong, and Just Schools by Annie Shimaru. And Max hosted Anne just a few months ago. Her book, Just Schools, is phenomenal if you haven't read it yet. And Sue Hong names those 3 pieces that we need to really work on: repairing relationships, renewing perspectives, and reinventing the school. And then Annie Shimaru talks about starting with families' priorities, not ours, seeing families, particularly families of color, as experts, giving families and communities the resource, time, and space to come up with solutions, not just share their pain, and then help families and educators learn to facilitate these gatherings, as well as ensuring families have real influence on change, not token. So really, those 8 guide what our focus in FET is all about at the 28 schools that I work closely with each month. You can see here some teams in action. And as I mentioned earlier, if you haven't checked out the book, I hope you will. It really lays out how to design a team, recruit parents, and every kind of step in doing this work more deeply. I'd often come home so inspired from these gatherings, 9 o'clock at night, but wanting to capture stories and quotes because it just was continuously moving to see what shifts when we make space for families and educators to connect more personally. So to get into the nitty gritty, because our time is relatively short, gatherings are held once a month for an hour and a half. A lot of our teams, because our communities have a lot of Spanish-speaking families, our focus in FED is on immigrant families. They often, for decades, we were guessing what they needed instead of asking, listening, and then putting into place what they told us. Most of our gatherings are held in Spanish with interpretation. Many gatherings are held in English, and then there's interpretation into 3, 4, 5 different languages. And the idea is that there's at least 5 educators and 5 family members and a school leader present. Often it's much more than that. Last night I was at a FET gathering where, due to 5-degree temperatures, it was low turnout, but we had a rich conversation. So it's not so much about how many people are in the room, but the quality of connection. We provide dinner and childcare. Each team has designated leaders, so we really distribute the family engagement work beyond the one champion at a given school or putting it all on the school leader's shoulders. There's money, and it doesn't require much money to do this meaningful work. It's really just to feed people dinner. I bring together leaders from across the schools in a network 4 times a year to really learn about leadership lessons from each other. And I'd say one of the biggest pieces is often in schools, we are rushing to prepare the meetings we're about to lead. And what I found was that if we spend an hour planning each gathering, we ensure that it's engaging and thoughtful, and families and educators come back. Um, Over 5 years, and this a lot was based on my background in social emotional learning, this was what we came up with, the best way to create an engaging, meaningful meeting. And you can see the rough structure, which I go into a lot more depth, of course, in the book. And pretty critical that we don't just jump straight into business, that we do a lot to create a space of joy and connection in those opening minutes. And I can happy to answer questions about that in a few minutes. You could see in the previous slide that part of the time, 15 minutes, is for what we call family learning. And these are the kinds of topics that families tell us in October we want to learn more about. So they're driving what they learn about, and we're bringing in people who can share. And it's not the typical, we talk at you for 15 minutes. It's 2 or 3 minutes of information and letting parent questions drive their learning. What's been powerful as well is when we ask parents thoughtful questions, it's really illuminated all of these gaps that exist, and we begin to tackle them. We often focus in the States on achievement gaps and opportunity gaps, but these seem to be other gaps that we often don't even put a spotlight on. That once we reveal these gaps, we can really talk about how do we reduce and transform them. And really, this idea of it's a multicultural committee of decision makers. And, I think about one school where at the first meeting, a mom who had been a part of another team, she boldly said, she asked, when are there after school enrichment opportunities? I have no idea, and I want my child to take advantage of them. A teacher said, oh, they're on our website. And then I think the principal said, oh, yeah, but we're not updating those. And then the parent, because she was particularly confident, she said, none of us are going to check your website. And what that led to over the next 2 meetings was they co-created a frequently asked questions document. And parents helped mold the answers so that they were really easy to read. And that 4 or 5 page document provided all the information that parents are often lacking when we dump all of that into a single email or into some long 30-page handbook. So that's another example of just kind of the changes that can be sparked when we really build trust. And as Dr. Mapp talks about, relational trust is the key essential condition. So you'll see as I share a little about some of the best practices. So this is one of my favorite graphics. This shows not only what family engagement practices are best for relationship building, but as you can see, it's about academic learning. And so part of the FET mission is how do we authentically, when parents have brought it forward, how do we begin pushing the staff towards implementing something like home visits or regular two-way communication or positive phone calls? One of our high schools last year sent 1,490 positive postcards throughout the year. So really embedding these systems and giving teachers the time so it's not one more thing. And as one teacher said, that's different. In other schools, there was nothing in place to connect us with families. Here, we're family. It's not us and them. It's us together, which was part of the inspiration for the title On the Same Team. We did an analysis of our strategic plan a year ago after 5 years, and it was wonderful to hear the conclusion that everyone was in consensus that FET was incredibly valuable and resulted in creating stronger relationships, and that the families felt they could bring up any issue and it would be addressed. I wanted you just to see briefly what parents say about FET. So I'm just going to, for time's sake, just cruise through these quotes. But you can hear the impact through their words. So in a half an hour, that was kind of a big picture overview. I'm hoping your questions will really drive our conversation. I wanted to share some resources, some articles, as well as some books I love in the field. And just close with this reminder that family engagement is not an initiative, nor is it a race. It's really a commitment to changing school culture, and as such is ongoing and never ending. I also will be able to share slides and some other resources with you. I'm going to go up to the top real quick. I forgot at the beginning to share with you. If you go to this link, um, if you go to that bit.ly link, and just enter your name and your email address, I'll make sure to send you some articles, some different podcasts and other resources. And I imagine Max will be sharing the slides with all of you. So with that, I want to shift to questions. Looking forward to some lively conversation.